And in a post-industrial era, these big boys have decided, and their masters too, that we are simply superfluous and they no longer need us. We're living through a stage today, as I say, where this is all coming to a culmination. This is the post-industrial era. We're post-technical almost in the West. It's all done in other countries, all the technical stuff. And Brzezinski himself talks about the technocratic era, where the future will be for an elite with a highly trained bureaucracy underneath them and scientific elite who will not need the human labor that they've needed in the past. Human labor that is excessive and is unemployed and is hungry is now a threat to that established elite. Hence, we have big foundations coming forward and organizations like the Optimum Population Trust who have decided to come out openly and demand that governments start radically reducing the populations. We are now the useless eaters, as Lord Bertrand Russell called us. Our ideas, our opinions on everything, our worldview, even to do with population and the fake view that we're overpopulated, is all projected to us by the mainstream media, working in concert for their masters. And we begin to parrot what we hear through repetition. And that's so important, is repetition with slogans and catchphrases. And once you hear it happening in your own local group, your milieu, then you know it's working. And the camera can make anything appear to be true. You'll see that in India, for instance, they always use the same streets of Bombay to make you think that you're massively overcrowded. And that's the impression people think of the entire Indian continent. The Indian continent is huge, with thousands and thousands of miles of forest where no one lives. It's the same in Africa too. China, being the model state for the world, for instance, put into effect the United Nations policy to the extreme with its population reduction and the movements of people off of the rural areas into cities. They started that years ago. Right now, they're in the process of moving 200 million more people off into the major cities, and that's the major newspapers. The cities appear to be crowded because everyone's being moved into them. In the Western world, since the 1950s, again under the term of urban sprawl and stopping urban sprawl, the Western countries also signed agreements to do no more building in the outskirts and of the major cities. All existing buildings have to be used or else knocked down and replaced with even higher ones. But regardless, with the immigration from third world countries, the Western countries appear to be overcrowded. And yet the UN's own statistics show, and so do the national census show, that the Europeans, for instance, Canadians and Americans, are actually in decline. So the overpopulation problem is simply an image projected by the media as more and more people are crammed into the same cities and they bring more immigrants in to fill them. So now they're doing something which they can only do to the human species. They don't need to do this with animals. With animals, just go out and hunt them and kill them. We are the only species that has to be convinced to allow ourselves, for the good of all, to be sterilized and bring down the population through abortion on one end and euthanasia on the other, under the guise to save the planet. And unfortunately, with the massive propaganda campaigns that are all over media in every country at the same time, with all the big foundations backing them with unlimited financing, then they can pull all of this off, and unfortunately it really is working. In kindergarten now, you walk into a kindergarten anywhere in Europe or Americas, and you'll see the rainbow inside every single one of them. You'll see all the terms about the world. Here's the globe, we're all global. And you'll see the greening messages everywhere, everywhere, and how sacrifice will have to be made to save the world and the planet and future generations of society. Sacrifice. You tie that together with the institutions that were comprised of the Fabian Society. It was a member of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. That's one society. The Council on Foreign Relations is also the same thing as the Royal Institute for International Affairs. They are what Thatcher and Professor Carroll Quigley called the parallel government. They have told us what the future is going to be. Some of their members have even written books about the need to cull off massive amounts of the population by any means possible. And so we see this final stage being pushed as they convince us that we are the problem. The Club of Rome, that also belongs to the same group, in the 1990s, the two founders said that back in the 1970s at the Club of Rome, they were given the task as a premier think tank for the globe, this global society, the task to find ways of reducing the population and controlling the people to go along with this, convincing the public how to go along with it. And what they came up with was that man was the enemy of the planet. They said that the idea that global warming could be created and blamed upon mankind would fit the bill. These are the words they used. That would fit the bill, written in the 1970s, and decided at the think tanks then, and published by the guys involved in a book called The First Global Revolution, well worth reading. When they hit upon an idea from a premier think tank, they will never change that agenda. I've said before, it wouldn't matter if we're up to our eyes in snow all year round. They will still stick to global warming. That's the agenda. Now, of course, they've changed it slightly to climate change, which simply means changes in the weather. And they're in the process now of convincing the general public to be afraid of summer, for instance. It's all done through the alteration and distortion of perceptions. Massive psychology is used on all of this. And they certainly understand mass psychology of the general public. I've been speaking about the Rockefeller Foundation. I was mentioning the fact that in the United States, the Rockefeller Foundation, which also runs, I think it is the Carnegie Foundation today, maybe even the Ford, they're all combined. And the families that are given the intergenerational rights, if you like, or authority to lead the world to amalgamation under global governance. Mr. Rockefeller also is heavily involved in the world depopulation strategies. He funds abortion clinics across the planet. He also funds hundreds of other front foundations that you would think were independent from his, but they're actually front foundations. He funds them all through his money. You can trace them all back again to so-called family planning clinics across the entire globe, especially in the third world countries. It seems that Mr. Rockefeller is intensely worried about overpopulation in the near future from countries which will have no industry, etc. And he sees it as his right to start the decimating process, basically, of depopulation. Last winter, I got an invitation to attend something called the World's Citizenship Council, the annual meeting. That kind of floored me because the head of the World Citizenship Council is Mr. Rockefeller himself. And here I am speaking out about and against them. So this did not come out of the blue. They try and get you on board working for them. What was also more startling was they always give members maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes to speak, and I was offered that to speak on stage to this world meeting. He said I'd be allowed to speak at this conference. He did not say what to speak about, or didn't say anything about what not to speak about. And he also said that this chairman, of course, who wrote to me, he also said that I'd be allowed to participate in the round table groups which come after. I did not attend. I was tempted to go just to see if they would ask me not to speak about certain things, but it was the middle of winter and the journey to this university would have been pretty hectic anyway, and I was so busy. But you will be approached, and that's not the first time I've been approached to do this kind of thing. A difficult thing for some people to understand is what's happening today is not just an elite making a final move to take over anything. Every generation for hundreds of years has been brought up with the same elite's predecessors designing and running the show for each generation. The elite, in fact, are simply moving their system into a new system, an updated system to suit themselves. That's a hard concept for people to grasp. They've been trained to believe things are happening at the moment by happenstance, by crisis coming out of nowhere. And here's what we must do. We must solve this problem at the time. Nothing is further from the truth. You're up against something, a system that's very, very, very old. It's the only truly organized system on the whole planet. It uses sciences that are ancient in population management. It gave us a system of money. Money is a tool that we must believe in to serve them. Karl Marx was quite right. He was one of their boys who was set up to set up the dialectic. And he was quite right when he said that money is a tool of the elites. Therefore, it's essential that the workers believe in money. The elite have all the money in the world. They own all the resources in the world. They don't need money, but they need us to believe it's the only thing that we must use. Today, the power of the purse, as they call it at the top, is being used to the maximum. I've researched so many books. I've got a library of my own. I like paperback books, or at least hardback books, because they're permanent records of the past. And if you can't understand the past, you won't understand the present or the future. They believe, and they believed by Darwin's time, that all of the people who had the right stuff to excel in life, to acquire wealth, good, intellects, property, and keep a hold of it through generations, had already been born. Therefore, anything that came after Darwin was just chance, perhaps, or luck. Therefore, all the elite families were already established. There would be no more elite families. Everyone else married in common because they did not have their wives or their husbands picked for them. They were not mated up for eugenical reasons. They were called commoners. In the 1950s, a book came out called The Next Million Years. And that was done by Charles Galton Darwin. Charles Galton Darwin was the grandson of Charles Darwin. He was a top physicist in Britain, worked on atomic energy, weaponry and so on, but he also was attached to other delegations at the United Nations, had a lot of power, was well known, getting a lot of exposure on political viewpoints and social viewpoints in the media. And he came out with the book in the 50s called The Next Million Years. The Next Million Years is an astonishing book because it's an incredible boast of how an elite would literally rule the world for another million years, and how it would be done, not just could be done, but would be done. And he said, we are in the process, in the 1950s he said this, in his own book, we are in the process of creating, he says, slavery has always existed in one form or another. There's different ways to have slavery. You can either get a bunch of henchmen, force a tribe into obeying you and being your slaves. That's a lot of force. But you have to feed them, etc. Or you can allow them to keep so much of their earnings for themselves, to maintain themselves, and take off all the rest to supply the elite and the structure of the system over them. But he says, we are now in the process of creating a more sophisticated form of slavery. In other words, the general public who would drift into the system and it would become natural for them would never twig on that they were actually slaves. You tie that in with the institutions that the Huxleys and the Darwins belong to. The Royal Institute for International Affairs, which has branches in every country in the world, they set up the United Nations. They said in their own writings, from the earliest times to the present, the world they're bringing in is to be a world where everyone who is born, or would be allowed to be born to serve the state. That would be their sole function. That's if they had a job for you to fulfill or a need for you. But it's a more sophisticated form of slavery. And we're going through it today. These families have been at this for at least centuries, and I think much, much longer. Now, eugenics goes back, as I say, into the most ancient times. All kings and queens were mated up for their supposedly inherited traits as leaders and even as gods by the priesthoods who kept records of the traits, the physical and mental personality traits of offspring of these unions. The agenda, since at least Darwin's time onwards, was to create a superior type of human. They toyed with the idea of creating even a superior type of worker to serve the superior class. Someone who could be very, very healthy, bright enough to accomplish all the tasks, but not too bright to overthrow the dominant minority. That's what the utopia, or the utopic idea, is basically based upon. If they could get the public to devalue human life, and that's in the writings of Julian Huxley. He says if we can get society to devalue human life, he says, and take humanity off its pedestal as a supreme being on the planet, then, he said, we can bring in our controlled society with a workable population. Everything works within culture towards an agenda. It's the world of sustainability, Mr. Rockefeller, the population reduction plan. Those who will go into the future will be those who are necessary for the future's maintenance, and those who are simply obsolete, the useless eaters, will have to perish and die off. It's as simple as that. This generation today, the ones who are alive today, we are the generation that's going through the biggest changes in history, according to even Rockefeller himself, since the Industrial Revolution. It's the end of one phase of a long-term plan. And out of this comes a new world order. As Mr. Brown said, the Prime Minister of Great Britain said at the G20 meeting recently, it's a new world order, a different order from the previous one, where people technically were working for themselves, would choose their own employment and so on. The new world order is a planned system, a planned economy, a planned population. So it's up to us. It's not up to the next generation to change this. We're the only ones who can possibly do the changing. And it's either really the rights to go into an uncertain future, which is what life should really be, where we decide for ourselves where we want to go individually and collectively, or allow ourselves to be dumb animals, creatures who are guided by those who have decided they are the masters of our destiny, and allow ourselves gradually to be sterilized, killed off, used for the last part of their agenda and their wars, and then cast off. Many people will love socialism. They enjoy being guided, and they enjoy their bosses running the world for them. But it's up to those who like freedom, personal freedom, which also entails uncertainty of where we're actually going to go.